In this lesson, we'll learn some of the technical reasons why we should be shooting raw images. All right, so in order to get a better understanding of this, we need to understand how cameras create the digital files. So essentially what happens is light comes in through the front of the camera, through the lens, and then it hits a chip in the camera that's called a sensor. Now that sensor converts the light that it sees into electrical charges. Now, depending on the light values or how much light it sees in different areas that's coming through the lens, will determine the different values that the sensor can read for and then convert into those electrical charges across the overall sensor. And then those values get saved off into a digital file, and that is our photograph. Now, any digital file has different limitations. So, for example, a digital file like a Word document is going to store completely different types of information than something like a JPEG image. And so there are limitations to a Word document that you may not have with a JPEG image, and vice versa, just because there's different types of information. Essentially, a digital file is a bucket that contains information. So the type of information and how much of that information it can store is determined by what type of digital file that is. Going back to the example of a Word document, you're going to get completely different type of information in a Word document than you would in a JPEG image. So let's look at what the limitations are of a JPEG image. So essentially, the JPEG file format can store three color channels. There's a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel, or RGB. Now, each of those channels is an 8-bit, or has 8-bit color depth. So that's 8 BPC, or 8 bits per channel. Essentially, what that means is each channel can store 256 different color tones in each one of those channels. In the red channel, so 256 in the red channel, 256 in the green channel, and 256 in the blue channel. When you multiply all of those together, a JPEG image can store over 16 million possible color tones. Now, that's a lot of color tones. However, JPEGs also are, by definition, a form of compression, or they have a form of compression, which means that there will be some data lost when you save a JPEG image. That's just what happens with the JPEG file format. Now, on the color tones, we have 16 million. So the human eye can see between 10 and 12 million colors. So the JPEG image can already store more colors than the human eye is capable of seeing. This is why JPEGs are commonly used for really high quality photos, why really they're so popular and really have become a standard for images, especially on the internet, because you get a mixture of more colors than the human eye can see. So you're going to get some really, really great quality images with a JPEG. And you have that built-in compression, which means that it's going to store a little bit better. It's going to transfer across the internet a little bit better and be able to be displayed a little bit better. So just like JPEG images, RAW images have limitations as well. So a RAW file format also can store three color channels, red, green, and blue. Each of those can store up to 16,383 colors per channel. Now, the exact amount is going to vary because it kind of is determined by your actual camera model, or more specifically, what type of sensor you have in your camera. So when the light comes in and hits the sensor, what type of sensor that is and the capabilities of that sensor will be what determines the raw format that your camera can export. Now, if it's 14 bits per channel, that's a pretty common. 12 or 14 bits is pretty common for a lot of digital camera sensors. Now, That means if you multiply those, you're going to get like 4.3 or almost 4.4 trillion colors. That's a lot of colors. Now, in addition, raw files are lossless, which means that there's no compression or no data lost when you save that raw file. Essentially, the raw file is exactly what, or as close as you can get to what the actual sensor sees. It's not making any changes to the file like it would with a JPEG due to the technical limitations of the JPEG file format. Now, there's a lot of different types of raw files out there, and depending on your camera's manufacturer, you might see different file types. So, for example, a Nikon camera has an NEF raw format. A Canon has CR2. Sony is ARW. Olympus is ORF, and so on and so on. Each camera manufacturer has their own raw format. Now, what Adobe did was essentially they said, we have all these different types of formats. Let's create one standard format that we can use in perpetuity or get the best amount of longevity from all these different types of file formats. So as a photographer, if you have multiple cameras, you're going to end up with a lot of different types of raw images. So you can actually convert those into a digital negative that is Adobe's attempt at creating a standard raw format. We actually have another lesson in this course that talks about how to convert the various raw formats into DNGs. Now, if the human eye can see between 10 to 12 million colors, why do we need trillions of colors in our photograph if our eye isn't even going to be able to see them? Really, the reason is because of flexibility. Now, in the previous lesson, we saw a perfect example of this when we started to adjust the colors of a sky. We started to get some strange banding effects. And that was because there wasn't enough color information in the JPEG image to make the changes that we wanted. Even though there were millions of colors and more than our eye could see, once we started to make changes and started to process that, we very quickly hit that limitation. Something that's not there will be much more difficult to reach with a raw image. Now, there are pros and cons to everything. So JPEGs tend to be very fast previews because of that compression. They have a pretty small file size because of that as well. You can use them immediately because pretty much anything can see a JPEG image. That'd be computers or phones or cameras, or they're pretty universally expected, or universally accepted. So you can expect that if you send somebody a JPEG, they'll be able to open it without installing any extra software. Now, unfortunately, as we talked about, due to the technical limitations, you can start to get artifacts, banding, or unwanted effects when you start to do a lot of post-processing to your JPEG images. Now, something else as well is that the camera will actually bake some of that color information into the photo because it compresses it down into the data file. Once again, due to the technical limitations of JPEG images, it actually bakes that into the photo. Now, when it comes to a raw file, you're going to get plenty of colors for your post-processing. Essentially, as close to what the sensor can see is what you're going to get in the raw, which means it's the best for making changes and doing your post changes. It also doesn't bake information like white balance and things like that into the actual image. You can make those changes in post, and we'll look at that as well in other lessons in this course. Some of the cons to a raw file is that they tend to be larger file sizes because they're lossless, they're uncompressed, they are larger, which means if you have more of them, look into buying some bigger hard drives. And another con is that they're not really a standard, so you can't, for example, most mobile phones or things like that can't read them natively without installing some special software. So typically you'll need to process them into whatever your final image will be. Now, for that reason, a lot of digital cameras these days will allow you to take both a JPEG and a RAW image at the same time. Now, this is really kind of the best of both worlds. It does take up a little bit more space because you're creating two files, but it gives you a file that you can preview right away, which is your JPEG, and a file that you can use for your advanced editing later on, your RAW image. So really, it's the best of both worlds. And we saw a little bit of what this looks like on the camera in the previous lesson and how to process both of those at the same time in Lightroom. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned some of the technical details behind why it's better to shoot in Camera Raw. Now, because there's more data captured in the RAW file, we'll have a lot more flexibility to adjust and process our photos in Lightroom and Photoshop.